longer, and then we're going to go ahead and start. And the rest of us are here, and we're excited to get started in a moment.
Testing. All right, we're good.
Ready? I'm ready, man.
Yeah, I'm going to come over this direction.
Yeah, you just move over and then he can sneak up.
Jim gets to sit over there if he shows up.
Take odds.
We ready?
All right. Oh, that's a little hot. Good evening and welcome to our God and Science seminar. I'm your host, Derek, the youth minister, Ben, and Ben's lackey, who was asked to come up here and host and moderate for this evening. Tonight we are joined by two of our three illustrious guest speakers. We have, first up, Cole Fakes. Cole received his undergraduate degree in mathematics and philosophy from Oklahoma State. Go Pokes. His master's in divinity from Oklahoma Christian, and is currently finishing his PhD in philosophical theology at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Cole is the senior pastor of Carlton Landing Community Church in Carlton Landing, Oklahoma, and is the president of So We Speak Media. And last and certainly least is our very own. He said I could say that. I put it in there, and he said I could leave it in, and that's payback for this morning. Is our very own Ben Williams. Ben received his undergraduate degree in astrophysics from the University of Oklahoma. He went on to receive his MDiv from Oklahoma Christian and is now pursuing his PhD in philosophy and apologetics from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Ben also currently serves as the senior minister for the Central Church of Christ right here in this place that we're in. Tonight, our panel will attempt to answer some of these fairly difficult questions about the intersection of faith and science. All these questions that the panel is going to be answering tonight are questions that you guys posed, that they sifted through. And so, without further ado, here we go. I'll let Cole answer this first one. Cole, in a 2015 Pew Research... No, I'm giving this to Ben, sorry. Right?
Head fake, oh my gosh.
Ben, you said it.
Ready.
No, you asked for it, right? Okay, sorry. In a 2015 Pew Research poll found that 59% of Americans would say science and religion are often in conflict. Are science and faith enemies, allies, or neither? What are some of the common misunderstandings that you hear about faith and science?
So the main difficulty of faith and science today is a PR problem, not a reality problem. In reality, there isn't a conflict between faith and science, really at any level. In fact, there's been some phenomenal work done in the last few decades, and beyond that, demonstrating that science is in desperate need of the philosophical contributions of the Christian faith. The science that we have today developed out of the Christian Western world. Okay, the Greeks were way ahead in terms of geometry and philosophy. The Greeks didn't develop modern science. The Chinese culture, way ahead in terms of technology and a lot of things that they didn't develop modern science. Modern science developed out of the Christian West because it was only in the Christian West that anybody believed the world was the result of a rational, thoughtful creator and therefore worth studying. If you think that the creation is the result of a kind of whimsical pagan deity or just brute fact, there's no guarantee it will ever make sense. So why would you stare at it and try to figure it out? But when you read the writings of guys like Isaac Newton and many, many others of that era, they're devoutly religious people who believed the world made sense because they believed God made sense. And it was just a matter of kind of catching up with whatever God had in mind when he made things. Newton wrote way more on religious topics than he did about science. His commentary on Daniel is kind of ridiculous, but it's lengthy. I mean, he was very interested in the Bible and scriptures, in Christian thought and theology, and his thought in science was just kind of a byproduct of that. So without that underneath, you never get to science in history. And the same would be true today. There's a lot of Christian assumptions that are in the sciences that just aren't recognized as that. You have to tell the truth in science. I mean, if you're not honest on your lab report, then the science you didn't make a lot of sense, right? It doesn't do anybody any good if you fabricate data. Well, where does the imperative to tell the truth come from? We didn't discover that under a microscope. That is the heritage of Christian Western civilization, saying honesty is kind of a big deal. I mean, all of those things just kind of coalesce to make science possible. And I think we take that for granted because we've had it so long. We've always lived in the Christian Western civilization. And so now we can pretend we can be atheists and not care about our Christian heritage and still do science, and I suppose you can. But just remember, we stole all that stuff from the Christians who came before us, and there's definitely no animosity there. The appearance of conflict, as I say, is a PR problem. Christians don't always present our views very well. Christians don't always articulate it very well. We have a tendency to strain at gnats and make mountains out of molehills. Some Christians, certainly in the sciences, have even given Christianity a bad name at times, and that happens. And so that to me is the bigger problem. It's a PR problem more than it is a reality problem. But
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think when we talk about faith and science, one of the tensions that I want to put out on the table early in this conversation is there's a difference between method and interpretation. So, and I know we'll come back to this over and over again, but when you say science, do you mean the method of the scientific method, or do you mean the deliverances of science in the sense that when we say there's a difference between faith and science, we usually mean the deliverances of science. So this conclusion over here that seems like a scientific consensus seems different than this over here, which seems to be a biblical consensus. That's what we usually mean. But in some ways, that's actually getting way too far down the road in order to be able to assess whether science itself and the deliverances of faith, of Scripture, of reason are at odds with each other. And so I think one of the things in the PR problem that we have is when we say science, we need to spend a lot of time talking about what we actually mean by science. And I would say that the starting place has to be method. When we say science, do we mean that the method of making a hypothesis, having data, checking your results, looking for repeatable, falsifiable claims, is that at odds with faith? Or is what we perceive to be the consensus of the scientific community to be at odds with faith? And those are two very different things.
Good job. There we go. I don't know if it's a good answer or not. I'm not smart enough to sift through all of this. Cole, next question to you. As someone at your time in Crossings, you worked closely with college students while you were there. How do you kind of think that faith and science interact on a college campus? And then, what do you think that churches could do to better equip, high school and then college students with understanding the relationship between science and faith?
Yeah, I remember being just stopped dead in my tracks when I read a statistic when I first started doing college ministry that only 1% of youth and young adult pastors had done a series on the interaction between faith and science in the last 10 years. Now we're even further, but I would bet that stat has not gone up drastically. It's something that's not talked about, but it's a boogeyman that exists in every church. Okay, every church has a narrative that our kids are going to go off to college, they're going to get into some biology class, or they're going to get into a humanities class, and they're going to be talked out of their faith. And yet, there's very little educating and discussion that we do in order to address that problem. And so there's a couple of things that I've noticed on college campuses that I think are helpful for us to think about as Christians, and that is, first, the scientific consensus, again, not necessarily the method, but the scientific consensus is the norm on a college campus. And what happens when you have a norm that's defined by something like a scientific consensus or kind of like a methodological atheistic system is it defines what's called a plausibility structure. What is it that could possibly be true? And whatever it is in your mind that brackets what could possibly be true is going to dictate how you interpret everything. So what science does on a college campus is it defines a certain box that all of your assumptions need to fit into. All your experiences, all of your past need to fit in this box. And the box that you are given, when you almost from the moment you move into the dorms on a college campus, is a materialist, behaviorist box. And we reject that as Christians. We do not believe that that is the extent of what is possible in the world. But what you're going to get is a quick and compelling explanation for every phenomenon that fits into that box. So the second thing is science, quote unquote science, the deliverances of science on a college campus. And we need to expand our thinking about science here. This is not just your microbiology classes. This could be as true in a number of subjects as it is in the hard
Just physics.
science.
Only physics.
Yeah, physics is the boogeyman. But is that the scientific consensus is not afraid to speak to the issues that young people really care about. And so if you want an answer to why you feel the way you do, there will be one. If you want an answer to why the world is the way it is, you will get one. If you want an answer to what you should do with your life, you will get one. Because college professors, college advisors, teachers in your classes are not afraid to speak to the things that are the most relevant in a young person's life. And unfortunately, sometimes we kind of play this game as Christians, especially in churches, where we don't want to force something on our young people, which I think is an admirable goal. But don't for a moment think that a college professor is going to think the same way about that question as you are. They would love nothing more than to force what they think on their students. They will not think twice about that. This is what I think, this is how the world is, this is what you should believe. And if you want to be accepted on this campus, this is what you should think. Okay, it's not always quite as stark as that, but there's no problem on a college campus with presenting information that way. And when you compare that to some of the answers you've gotten previously, sometimes that sounds really appealing. So I would end with this, is the scientific consensus on a college campus is the water that college students swim in. And in order to reverse that course, in order to see what's going on, you need people in your life, at your church, your friends, other Christians, to come along and actually be self-critical and outwardly critical of the things that you're starting to imbibe, right? It's the cliche saying of the fish swims along and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the other fishes look and they say, "What's water?" Right? When you swim in it for so long, you begin to forget that it's there. And I think on a college campus, that's one of the things that churches can really do well, is to say, yeah, you heard this, but what do you think about that? How does that square with, how does this play out? Have you challenged that thought? Or is there another way to think about this? Or maybe your box is too small. Maybe this isn't all that's plausible in what you're getting. So you've done as much with college students as I have. What do you think?
So yeah, all that. And I would add the complaint that Christians haven't shared their worldview well is fair, but as you and I discuss a lot, the answer to doing something badly isn't to stop doing it, it's to do it better, right? So Christians have at times shared our worldview with our kids badly, and we gave that perception of, oh, we're forcing it down their throat, which was bad, okay? And so we've reacted to that by, we'll stop talking about that. Well, no one else has stopped talking about it. In fact, the world as a whole is talking as much as it ever has, maybe more, right? So the response need to be not, we're going to not talk about those difficult issues. It's we have to learn to talk about them better. And that's going to apply to everything, whether it's morality or secularism, philosophy, science, everything. We just have to do a better job of it and be consistent in it. Another point I'd add, and see what you think on this, that one thing we can do better with especially high school students and college students is to help them see how their faith and their career, especially if it's a career of interest in the sciences, might be connected. I had this fun experience at a church camp with a group of mostly seniors in high school, and I asked them what their career plans was, or what they were. And they, hemmed and hawed, but most of them had some vague idea of either I'm going to trade school or I'm going to college or I have a job plan. They had some plan of what they were going to do. And then I asked a different question. I said, if money was no object and like living in your parents' basement was an option, if it's like everything was on the table, right? If you could do anything you wanted, what would it be? And they had these amazing answers. One, said, I would love to go research Alzheimer's. Someone I loved suffered from Alzheimer's. I would love to go be a researcher in that. And they had these fantastic, positive, world-altering answers to what they would like to do with their life. But not a single one of them gave the same answer to what they planned to do and what they wanted to do. That they didn't see those as options. There was a practical option, and then there was something they were passionate about. Christian faith is one of the things that can bridge that gap, where you can find a way to do something with your life that you also believe is meaningful and good. We don't just need more Christians to be ministers. In fact, for those of you that are here this morning, I preached out of James 3 that says most of you probably shouldn't be ministers, right? Maybe we need less, but we do need Christians who are doctors and nurses and teachers and professors and every other job you can name. We need Christians in the helping sciences. We need Christians who are doing counseling and bring a Christian worldview with them rather than check it at the door. I mean, we need to inform our students at the high school and college level that you don't have to think of the real world and then your church world, that it's the same world. And I think that helps a lot with the science business, where that's also true in the sciences. And we don't often do a great job of that.
Yeah, I think this is something that we've been talking about lately, either on the podcast or in the panel that we did on this a couple of years ago, that Christians need to re-engage the scientific disciplines. So I think for a while in our culture, there's been a latent attitude towards the hard sciences, that if you're a young Christian person, don't do that. That's where you'll go to lose your faith. And I just absolutely disagree with that. I think that Christians have more reason than anyone in the world to engage the sciences. I want to read you this passage from 1 Kings 4 about Solomon. It says, "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdoms of all the people of the East and the wisdom of Egypt. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. People of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." If you read that and I didn't tell you there was a Bible verse, you'd say, this person sounds like a scientist, right? Like, he's so into the natural sciences. And if you believe what the Bible says, that he is the wisest person who ever lived, he's engaging himself in the same way that Aristotle did. He's engaging himself in the same kinds of things that you see Kepler doing or Galileo or whoever, because as Christians, we actually have a vested interest in exploring the world that God made. If you believe Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, then you have a mandate, because you know that as far as you explore, it's God's creation all the way down. No matter how far you go under a microscope, no matter how far you go out in space, this is God's creation, and you are God's creature. And Ben mentioned this earlier. the fact that God created both things creates this relationship between the two. That when you and I look under a microscope, of course I shouldn't be looking under a microscope, I have no training in that, but if you and I were to look under a microscope, we could understand what we see. How crazy is it that we can do things like produce mathematical and physical models of the universe that actually match what happens? That's because God's the creator of all of it. He's the creator of our minds, and He's the creator of the world. And so we have a mandate to explore and to understand the world. And so from a materialist point of view, like Ben said, there's no guarantee that there's a match. There's no guarantee that the further you go down, the more sense it makes. Instead, actually, it's a lot more likely that there is no method to the madness. And so if you lay those two options out and you say, which one of these people should be more enticed to go and explore the natural sciences? The Christian. 100% the Christian has the intrinsic motivation to do it. And so I think we'll talk about this later, but I think there's a lot of things shifting in science, quote unquote science today, and it's becoming a vacated space. And my thought is, why shouldn't it be Christians over the next 25 or 30 years that revitalize that space? I think it should be.
If you leave it to the other guys, you don't get to complain about what happens. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, if Christians aren't engaged in science, I guess it will probably take a non-Christian slant, and it will stay that way. So I wonder how we could fix that. Yeah.
All right, Ben. So there's a lot of apparent tensions that we see between faith and science, and how Christians kind of understand even the creation account that we find in Genesis. What do you think are some reasonable interpretive options as it relates to Genesis 1 and 2? What are the pros and cons of maybe each, and are there any interpretations that we should just kind of rule out completely?
I think that question's so simple, I'm going to let Cole answer it. Passage I would start with. This is my preamble anytime I'm asked to talk about Genesis 1 and 2 in science. You did 1 Kings, I'm going to do one better. We're going to do Ecclesiastes, okay? All right. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 14, and I'm sorry, verses 12, verse 11. I know where I'm at, yeah. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The message there of Solomon is that there are limits or horizons to human knowledge. That on the one hand, God has put a little eternity into every human heart. We have this curiosity, the sense of the divine, a desire to know, a desire to bring culture to God's world that He's given us. I mean, there's lots of good things there. A little eternity in man's heart, great. But not so much that you yourself become divine, right? Not that you get to say, I figured God out from start to finish. And in particular, that verse said, from beginning to end. That kind of the hardest places to see are the edges. So think about the two books of the Bible that we struggle the most to understand. Well, probably the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and that dragon stuff in the book of Revelation is kind of odd, right? Like the beginning, how did it get started? How does it all end? Those are the edges of the map, where God says, I'm going to give you kind of a view of that, pointing towards a horizon, but it's a little fuzzy over there on both ends because we're not God. So from Ecclesiastes, my first point in answer to that was, everybody has to come off their high horse just a little bit when it comes to your opinion about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and for that matter, the book of Revelation, right? Those are two topics that it's quite okay for Christians to say, I'm not so sure about that one, but here's what I think. Now, if you're right, you'll agree with me, but you don't have to. It is important to come to it with a fair bit of humility. I think there's probably 3 points of view that come out of reading Genesis 1 and 2 in modern debate and science and stuff like that. One of them I'm going to rule out and say it's garbage. Okay, so there's one emphatic point I'll make. And then there's 2 that I'll say, could be. And I'll give you some reasons for both, okay? The one that can't be, that does actually kind of irritate me, because modern science, the consensus has become a 14 billion-year-old universe and all that entails from Darwinian evolution and all that, like, because that's the consensus, there's been a desire to go back and read Genesis 1 and 2 and try to find that there, like that maybe encoded in Genesis 1 and 2 is Big Bang cosmology. If you just looked under the right verse, you'd find, oh, there's Darwin's theory of evolution, like it would be there encoded. That is the view I would rule out. Like, there is no way Moses was trying to convey that, okay? I'll give you two other points of view that give us some options, but there's no way you can read Genesis legitimately. One of the basic questions we ask in serious Bible interpretation, the first question, what did it mean to its original audience? Okay. Later, you can ask, what did it mean to me? But you start with, what did it mean to the people who heard it first? And there is no slave coming out of Egypt that reads Genesis 1 and 2 and says, obviously, 14 billion years, evolutionary descent from common ancestry. Like, no, there's no way anybody thought that's what it meant. Okay, so is that possible? That's option 2 and 3. We'll get there, but it's not encoded information. Is my first point. It's not if you just read it just right, you would find that. Okay, so there's 2 then remaining options that I'll give you, and being, as my early preaching mentor liked to say, I have friends on both sides of the issue, and I always agree with my friends. So I'll give you 2 options and give you 2 points of view on it, and then we'll go from there. Cole can tell us which one's right.
I just wish Dr. Baird was here.
This was going to be the one I'd say, and Jim, and then you could take the view that is what we typically call a literal view. Now, literal is one of those words that is actually very difficult to define. What does literal mean? But you could we'll call it like the surface apparent meaning view, okay? That when Moses says it was a day, then a day was 24 hours. That's how long a day is, and it takes a week to make a universe, okay? That would be one view. What would be in favor of that view? In favor of that view would be, it kind of is the plain reading to most audiences of what it meant. If you ask most ancient Jewish readers, if you ask most Christians in history, like 2,000 years of Christians, most of them will say, looks like a week to me. And
it's like a third of history. So.
It's a pretty big chunk of history. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big deal. So I think you have the consensus of history that says, yeah, that's pretty much what it means. And as a general rule, I don't like having a point of view that says, no one figured it out until me. Mm-hmm. Right? Everyone was wrong about Genesis until about 100 years ago, then we figured it out. That bothers me on a deep level, okay? So that would be one argument in favor of that reading. Another argument in favor of that reading is that it makes more sense. Let me say this. The overall big picture of Big Bang cosmology, which is the alternative, and kind of a young Earth creation, they have more separating them than just 14 billion years. I don't know if I can convey the shape of how big that problem is. I teach adjunct astronomy from time to time, and one of the things I have trouble teaching, even kind of at the secular level, is just how radically different that story is than you think it is. If you can imagine human history the universe's 14 billion year history as a 100-yard football field, okay? Where would you guess human history starts, okay? The universe is 14 billion years old. Let's make that 100 yards. Where does human history start? It's not the 50-yard line. It's not the 10-yard line. It's not the 1-yard line. It's not the 1-foot line. All of human history fits into the last inch of that football field in a 14 billion year scheme. I mean, you see how like that reverses in the Genesis kind of plain reading sense. The whole universe comes to be in a week, and then we get to the human stuff. In the other picture, everything else is pretty much all that's ever happened, and then the last inch is all of human history. That's a pretty different picture, okay? So those would be my 2 arguments if I were trying to make a really strong case. You've got to read it that way. I'd make those 2 points, rest my case, and go home, and we'd drink coffee. If I was making the other point of view, I'd say that there are some problems with that. I'd say, first of all, Genesis 1 is not trying to convey scientific information. Scientific information always involves cause and effect. This happened, and so that happened. Genesis 1 is not a cause and effect text. I'll give you an example. Day 1, God made the light. I sang it with the kids this morning in 6th grade Bible class. Day 1, God made the light when there was none. Okay, God made light. On day 4, God made things that make light. Star, sun, moon, day 4. Light, day 1. Anyone see the problem? In terms of cause and effect, the cause comes after the effect in the normal way of thinking of things. And so what that seems to say is, this isn't that kind of text. It's not trying to give you, God made a star, star made light, light got here. It's not trying to tell you that picture. It's not a cause and effect story. It's not trying to answer that question, because no one in the ancient world was asking that question. They weren't asking, what did the 14 billion year history of the universe look like? They were asking, is it the Egyptian gods or the Babylonian gods or the Sumerian gods, or who is it you're talking about, Moses? That was the question. And Moses is saying, it's this God, and this is how he did it, in the sense of, by his command, he brought a universe into existence. And that's the story he tells. And I think that would be a pretty compelling argument in favor of it. It's not a it's not a cause and effect text. And then the second point I'd make on that point of view is that you couldn't convey Big Bang science to an ancient audience if you tried. If you say, Moses, I want you to tell them the universe is 14 billion years old. He couldn't have done it. I teach adjunct astronomy. I have a really hard time explaining that to modern people, of how big the universe is, the size and scope of it, and in the system of the 14 billion years, like what would that even look like? That football field analogy I just gave you, that's the front page of my astronomy textbook, because we're all fishing for metaphors of like, how do we convey how big it is? How would you possibly explain that to an ancient audience who's talking of the world in terms of the pillars of the earth is a phrase used in Job? What? I don't think we just haven't dug far enough and gotten to the pillars yet. I think that when they talked about pillars of the earth, they probably didn't know much about modern geology and were just using terminology that made sense to them. Genesis 1 says God divided the water above the firmament from the water below the firmament. They're fairly convinced there's fluid above the sky, and while there's a couple of different interpretations of that, none of them really sound like my modern meteorology book. So they just didn't have the language. So those 2 points of view, like 4 days out of 7 in a week, I take one of them, and the other 3, I take the other. It just depends which day you come by my office. Those 2 are both treating the text honestly. That first view of, I believe in science first, I'm going to see if I can get it in there, I think is dishonest with the text. And so I think with Christians, you start with, what did this mean to the people it was written to? Then you're allowed to ask, what can it mean to me? But you have to start with the first one. Now fix that. What's the better answer?
Well, I think that's a great outline of these positions, because I think the tension that we're all wrestling with is the earth looks old. The universe looks old. That's one of the things you have to encounter in the observable universe, is this looks like a very old universe that we find ourselves in. And then on the other side of the tension is, but the Bible says it was created in 7 days, and there's not that much in here before that. And so somewhere between those two, we're trying to frame an issue in one of 2 ways. Experientially, by looking at the cosmos and looking at the models and the predictions and things, or, like Ben said, we're starting with the text. And my thought is, in terms of what is available in interpreting Genesis 1 through 11, we probably should start by emphasizing what Genesis 1 through 11 wants to emphasize. Right? Okay, so there's a great book, if you're interested in this question of how should Christians divide or not divide over the question of the age of the earth. There's a book by a guy named Ted Cable called Controversy of the Ages. And the argument in the book is, the age of the earth is not a good dividing line for Christians because it's not an emphasis in the text. Right. Instead, a good way for Christians to say what is available to Christians is to look at the priorities of Genesis. So like you're saying, we start with the text. So what's the first thing the text wants you to know? God created everything. Ex nihilo, out of nothing, God created everything. Secondly, God put things in place and created human beings as a unique, God-breathed, Spirit-filled, image-bearing part of creation. So actually, I would much rather divide, I would much rather say, old earth or new earth, let's go to the text and divide over whether or not there's an original, unique Adam and Eve, than I would, is the earth 14 billion years old or is it 6,000 years old? Yeah. I really think, like you said, those options are probably open to Christians. We can debate about that. But the emphasis of the text is, do you believe that God created this? And do you believe that human beings are unique image bearers that God created? And this will run along some different lines than the traditional groups because, you know, the way that you outlined it, you have three big groups. You have answers in Genesis. You know, this is kind of the like gold standard young earth creationism group. And there's some awesome stuff from that group. You have Biologos, who is the other side completely. You don't have to be Christian to be in Biologos. You know, Dennis Lamoureux has a book for them. I think it's called Creationary Evolution. And he says, the Bible doesn't teach us how God created the world, just that he did. Okay, so these are two extreme poles, and you have everybody in the middle. But if we say, well, the emphasis of the text doesn't cut along this spectrum, it's actually kind of a cross section, you're going to say to people in Biologos, it can't be that all of a sudden you have these hominids and they finally get consciousness and realize that they are what we now call Adam and Eve. I don't think that's a biblical category for the way that human beings were created. So I would say we need to frame the issue around the way that the Bible frames the question and move on from there. And that actually opens up a lot of different angles that we could approach on the age of the earth.
I'll just add, the way we currently talk about it in the debates we have is not even 100 years old. And here's what I mean by that. From Aristotle all the way down to the early 1900s, the consensus was that the universe had more or less always been here. Okay? The universe just is. And there's a physicist from Belgium who happens to also be a Jesuit priest who says, I have an alternative. I think there was a beginning. And he, a guy named Lemaitre, develops a model that was mocked and ridiculed by the scientists of his day. They made up a name for it. They called it the Big Bang. Like that, the Big Bang model was invented by a Jesuit priest who was arguing against the view that the universe doesn't have a beginning. In his mind, the first three words, in the beginning, means it started somewhere. And he said, that's where I'm drawing my battle line. Sir Fred Hoyle, who was at that time the most well-known and respected scientist, astrophysicist of a generation, rejected Big Bang cosmology, quote, because it smacks of Genesis. The idea that the universe started to him sounded like some kind of Christian trying to ruin science, right? Now think about that. We've come full circle. Now that's the consensus view, right? And it came from, again, a Christian point of view saying this idea that we've always been here, not going to cut it. Genesis said we had a beginning. Now with the consensus being, okay, it started how long ago? Let's fight about that. Now that's become the battle line. We're just 100 years ago. The debate was, have we always been here or not? And it was Christians who changed science and said, no, we're going to need a beginning to make this work. And it turns out they've been proven right over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Because the math doesn't work unless you start. So
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on to our next set of questions. This is deemed the lightning round. I don't know. You guys may still want to bounce them off of each other. I don't know how we're doing this.
As long as you give all the questions I have down for Jim to Cole, that's fine.
I'm going to. I'm throwing the first curveball right to Cole because I think this fits. We'll see how he does. Cole, earlier you were talking about the impressive predictive power of science. So you said that, so now I can use this question. Where sometimes faith, on the other hand, can seem to be wishful thinking. Not my words, guys. Don't get mad at me. As an example, is there room for Christian doctrine of prayer in the world of modern science? Is there room there? And then can prayer physically change the material world, or do we kind of just use it as a psychological exercise?
Okay, this is going to be really hard to be a lightning round question
I know.
here. But let me say this. I want to talk about two things on this question. One of them being method. I want to talk about the scientific method. So I want to get technical here for a minute. If you're in the scientific field, so the scientific method is called the hypothetico-deductive method. That's the kind of logic you use to do science. And this is where I think science as a method and science as an interpretive activity have gotten completely separated. So in order to actually do science, here's what you do. You get a bunch of data, then you make a hypothesis, then you test it, and then you can rule out what's false about your hypothesis. So this actually, a great explanation of what you do in science is in Sherlock Holmes. Anybody remember Sherlock Holmes? Okay, he is the ultimate in the scientific method. In A Scandal of Bohemia, he has this great line. So he says, I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have data, because inevitably you begin to twist facts to suit theories, not theories to suit facts. Okay, this is something that just strikes right at the heart of the scientific method. The scientific method actually is good at taking things that are really broad and making them really narrow, not things that are really narrow and making them broad. So for example, if you do an experiment and you are testing a hypothesis, since you actually cannot logically prove a negative, all you can do is disprove a positive. Right? That's actually the only thing that's available to us logically in the deductive method. We can actually take a statement that we believe to be true and prove that it is false. But we cannot take a statement that's false and prove that it is false. So in science, what we're doing is we're actually narrowing theories with boundary conditions, with different substances, with whatever your discipline is, narrower and narrower parameters to say, this is experimentally true. And what we mean by that is to say, we have ruled out as much as we can to know that this is repeatable and falsifiable. That's what science does. So to go from, okay, we can do all these experiments and narrow down a thesis or a hypothesis into something like a natural law is a narrowing exercise. Interpretation is a broadening exercise. We see this happening, therefore this must always happen. That's not science. And the interesting thing mathematically about this is if you have a plot of data, so let's just say we have like a scatter plot of data, you actually can run a near infinite amount of lines of best fit through that data. So some are better than others, some of them have a smaller error boundage than others, but you actually can run a ton of ways to interpret that data. And what we're doing is we're placing all of these lines on this data, and we're saying that one's not as close as that one, that one's not as close as that one, that one's not as close as that one. So if you want to dive into this, Karl Popper's book on scientific investigation is a great book on this method. Some people don't like Karl Popper, but it's a great book on this. And this is really where you get to the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science is not just the what of science, it's the how and the why of science. So once you have a set of data that you have deduced down to a workable thesis, workable law or a theory of some kind, then you can bring values and experiential judgments to what you have already done in the lab. The problem for Christians a lot of times is we take the second step as the science instead of the first step. The second one is laden with all kinds of things. Values, predictions, biases of all kinds, and we all bring those to a set of data. But we as Christians need to be reminded of the fact that a person who's interpreting data is bringing the same kinds of biases and experiences that we're bringing to a set of data. It's actually better that we just declare what we are bringing to that data than pretend as if we're the only person that can be objective about this data. So that question on data, I say all of that to say the scientific method is so much smaller than what we think when we say the word science. So that I actually don't see any difficulty in saying science and the predictive power of science versus prayer and the predictive power of faith. It's actually not a Venn diagram. They're kind of concentric circles. So whether or not prayer changes things is more of a theological question than a scientific question. But I just love the dispute that C.S. Lewis has in his book Miracles, where he talks about, is it natural or unnatural for God to act in the world? So we have all these natural laws that are happening in the world, like gravity. And every time we drop something, it falls to the ground because the law of gravity. So if God were to intervene and all of a sudden you drop something and it doesn't hit the ground, would that be a breach of the laws of nature or not? And you know what C.S. Lewis says? I'm almost going to just defer to you to say this because you know Lewis better than I do, but C.S. Lewis concludes there's nothing more natural than for God to act in the world that He created. If you have a definition of natural law, especially as a Christian, if you have a definition of natural law that precludes the natural working of God in the world, it's not a very good definition of natural law.
I would agree with all of that, except that in my forthcoming dissertation, there's a chapter titled Karl Popper is Wrong About Everything. And you're going to want to read that. But yeah, all of that is absolutely.
Are you a Thomas Kuhn guy?
Thomas Kuhn, yeah. I can't believe I invited you up here.
Well, I would say they actually agree. In The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, which is Thomas Kuhn's book, they agree on this point and nothing else.
So what Kuhn would say is it's not about logic and deduction. That's Popper's thing. Kuhn would say the way science works is you get all this data and then you imagine a picture. And you just need to admit that you're imagining a picture.
Right.
So think about like ancient Greek constellations. Have you ever tried to find constellations and figure out like, that's a bear? Are you kidding me? It's not a bear until somebody says, see the bear, right? And that's surprisingly how science works. That someone has to kind of draw you a picture with the data and say, see? And then after you see it, you can't unsee it. I mean, it's like, it's always a bear now. Once somebody shows you how much Darwinian evolution explains, you go, well, it explains a whole lot. But before that, everyone thought something else explained it. Mm-hmm. It's just, so Kuhn's thing was, we operate on these pictures, and we just need to be honest about, we're making some of this up, and get off our high horse about sometimes the pictures change. For a very long time, the Earth was the middle of the picture. Now the sun's the middle of the picture. And the only thing, the data didn't change, the picture did.
Right.
And we learned to see it differently. Now I can't see it the other way.
Right. Yep. And the easiest thing to do is to prove that part of that picture is actually inaccurate, as opposed to my picture versus your picture. What we want to do is we'd actually want to go by the process of deletion. So we have this constellation in the sky, and we say, oh, that's I think that's a bear, and you say, no, I actually think that's a cow instead. We could both agree that it's not a sea monster. Okay,
it could be a sea monster. You draw me a sea monster up there, I'll say sure.
And you could say, well, that bear only has 2 legs, so it can't be a bear. That's the kind of deletion that we're doing in science between these competing pictures, because Kuhn is exactly right that we bring a framework to impose on a set of data. That's what we do. And then we've got to see if it's a good fit or not. Yeah. And science really is about whether or not it's a good fit.
It's about fit. Yeah.
All right. Kind of in alignment with that, we're talking about natural law. I think this kind of fits. So Ben, we received some questions about specific aspects of modern science. For example, naturalistic evolutionary theory seems to expect that there are life on other planets. This is a great question. I'm so excited. Would the discovery of extraterrestrial life change Christian faith or invalidate it in some way?
So this is actually a good question. This is something I like to share with people. This is one of these places where my background in astrophysics actually has some merit and value in the real world, because I got to sit in the physics student lounge and hang out with professors and students and hear what they talk about when they're not giving lectures, we are really concerned that there's no aliens. I don't know if I can convey to you how deeply concerned the scientific community is that we haven't found aliens yet. Like, I know for the average person, it's something for the Sci-Fi Channel, and we don't really worry about it. Behind closed doors, the scientific community is deeply concerned. Enrico Fermi famously said, it's called the Fermi paradox, because Enrico Fermi famously said, like 100 years ago, where is everybody? And we've been trying to answer that question ever since, because here's the problem. If God's not part of the picture, natural evolutionary processes just work. If they worked once, they have to work everywhere else, or at least somewhere else. And it's a really big universe. And so there was this guy named Drake who came up with an equation called the Drake equation. Turns out when you invent an equation, you name it after yourself. The Drake equation. And he said, I can calculate, our galaxy is this wide. There's this many planets that should be there. Of those planets, this many should have these chemicals on it. If you have these chemicals, the biologists told us that they produce life, like every time, at least they did here. And then if there's that much life, some of it is supposed to evolve from bacteria up to sentient being. And, at some point, they should be able to, and you can do the math. There's supposed to be like 60,000 intelligent civilizations in our galaxy alone, of which we found just us, where we started, right? Exactly one. So here's what I would say. If you're a naturalist, like, I don't believe in God, the whole universe makes sense without any of that religion nonsense, you really do have to struggle with the fact that we haven't found the other guys yet. There are some really creative solutions that are being posited about maybe they're out there, they just don't like us very much. That's a legitimate, conference paper level idea that they're out there, they think we're not very good, they don't talk to us. There are some other options that are circulated, but I'm serious, at legitimate scientific conferences, they're trying to fix this problem because it's supposed to be aliens, right? So if you don't believe in God, that is the one that is the problem. Now, it doesn't prove anything for the Christian point of view, because I can't prove there aren't any aliens. Have you ever tried to prove a negative? Try to prove that there aren't any anywhere in the universe. Well, I'd have to go everywhere in the universe and look according to the scientific method. So, you can't prove they're not there. But every year that passes, and we spend more money on we spend a lot of money, we don't tell you. We spend in astronomy a ton of money on really big satellites whose job it is just to listen. There are guys with little headsets waiting, right? And every year that passes and no one phones home, it becomes a little more embarrassing to that community that has to get more drastic in explaining it. Okay, now let's flip the coin the other direction. For Christians, if there are no aliens, we say, kind of figured that. Yeah, it's not a big deal. What if there were? If tomorrow we found life somewhere else in the universe, what would that mean? Well, the first question we'd want to know is what kind of life. There's nothing in the Bible that says there can't be any life anywhere else. So we'd want to ask, what kind of life are we talking about? If you find me a bacteria on Mars, I'm not going to throw out Christianity. That doesn't bug me in any way, shape, or form. God can put as many things out there as he wants, just waiting for us to find. Go for it, okay? If you discovered something that looked like sentient, intelligent life, then it is an interesting question, answered by, guess who? C.S. Lewis. No kidding. C.S. Lewis, 100 years ago, was writing, I wonder what would happen if Christians found aliens. C.S. Lewis was in favor of it. He said, we should search the galaxy. We should go find them. Because in his mind, it's not any different than finding a tribe you haven't met yet on an island somewhere, which we have this problem in missions all the time. So imagine there's an island tomorrow. You get onto Google Earth and you find an island that's never been discovered in the South Pacific, and there's people there, and they've never encountered any Christian people ever. Well, what do? Well, if you take a missions class, they say, well, are they human? Are they morally capable beings? Have they sinned? They need Jesus. And then if you want to ask the question, what if we hadn't found them? you go find your favorite theologian and say, what happens if they never got found? But that's the same question we ask about your next door neighbor, right? I mean, what if your next door neighbor never heard about Jesus? I don't get to answer all the questions about what God does in those circumstances. But now that I've got them, you go and you show them Jesus. C.S. Lewis says that's the same answer when we get to the other planet. When we find the other guys, if they're out there, step one, are you morally capable? Yes. Step two, have you fallen? Wouldn't it be a great surprise if we found the aliens and they're like, oh no, we all believe in God and have never sinned. What's wrong with you down there?
It's possible.
And they would send missionaries to us, right? Wouldn't that be funny? But let's say they've sinned, and then we say, okay, well, have you heard about Jesus? And we start there. But that was C.S. Lewis's answer. In his mind, it wasn't any different other than DNA in the fact that your next door neighbor hadn't heard about Jesus either. So it didn't bother him at all. So I think for us, it's a curious riddle. Like, it's fascinating to sit and think, what would happen to our church if the aliens showed up tomorrow? Like, it's a curiosity thing, but it doesn't undermine Christianity. On the other foot, not finding aliens is a deafening silence for the scientific community every single day, and it's starting to bother them. So it just means a lot more on that side of the aisle than to us. It's like, well, that's curious. Who cares? For over the other side, it's like, this is a big deal. Yeah.
I was under the impression that the CIA found aliens this year, so I guess I don't have anything to add to that question.
That's tomorrow. That's tomorrow night's conference. Actually,
Yeah, okay,
different
good.
speakers. Yeah.
We all saw Men in Black. Okay, Cole, let's talk a little bit about faith in science as it relates to kind of public policy, the marketplace of ideas. What would be the practical difference in our culture if God was recognized as creator, like publicly? Is God's existence merely religious, or is there a practical application to God being God?
Well, of course, I think there's a practical implication to this. I do think that God is not a local God just of people who believe in Him. He's the God of the universe, and He's the God of everyone. So I do think that as Christians, we have to be very careful. I heard a great metaphor the other day. It was like, so imagine there's a robber, and he's going out on the town to have a great time just robbing people. And he comes up behind this guy, and he pulls out a gun, and he says, okay, your wallet or your life. And the guy says, excuse me, I don't believe in guns. And the robber says, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that you didn't believe in guns. And he runs off to go rob somebody else. Who doesn't believe in guns? The robber or the person being robbed? Clearly, it's the robber who doesn't believe in guns at that point. Because what's happening for that scenario is one person is respecting the belief and non-belief of another person when they happen to know that the opposite is true. And that's exactly how we treat the Bible in the public square. So I don't believe in the Bible. Oh, okay, I'm going to go find somebody that believes in the Bible then. The Bible is true whether you believe it or not. God is the king of the universe whether you believe it or not. Philippians says that every knee is going to bow before Christ, and every tongue is going to confess that He is Lord, whether you believe in Him or not. So at the end of the day, for Christians, we really do find ourselves in a position where it's like, do you believe this or do you not believe this? And does the fact that somebody else doesn't believe this mean that you no longer believe this, or do you still believe it? And so with that said, I think it makes a huge difference in public policy whether or not we believe what this book says. And I'm not talking about just reenacting a theocracy, all of a sudden we go back to Old Testament law codes and you've got to keep all 613 commandments. I just mean, of course, the vision that we have for the common good and for human flourishing is going to be changed if we believe that God is reigning of the universe through His Son, Jesus Christ, who died for anyone who believed in Him. That makes a huge difference in how we see human flourishing. In fact, there's a good book by Andrew Walker called Liberty for All that just came out. And what he does is he says that actually the argument for a society that prizes the freedom of religion, he kind of redefines freedom of religion to freedom to believe and worship the way you want to, is a Christian value. And that's a little bit of a mind bender at first, because you think, how could it be a Christian value to have all these different religions? Well, what he says is, if you believe what the Bible says, that compelled belief is not true belief, then you want to promote a society where people are offered the gift that Jesus came to give them. And you are observant of the way that the Holy Spirit might work in those people. And you are observant of the fact that the common good, what we do with our government, through our tax dollars, through our civic organizations, through the way that we legislate things, is informed by the fact that we believe that this is God's world. So I do think that there would be huge implications if we believe that. And I do think that it would be a public policy matter. But I do think also that Christians can and should disagree about the means of living in a society like that. So I do think that if we all agreed on the common good and we all agreed on God's existence and Christ's death and resurrection, we would still have some really vigorous disputes about how to live that out practically. So I don't think this is a panacea for every social disagreement, but I do think it would make a huge difference.
All right. I'm going to throw a curveball to Ben now. Ben, do you believe that the Bible supports or denies the science of climate change? For example, 2 Peter talks about the world being destroyed by fire. I know, this is a massive curveball.
We're good.
And if so, is there anything that we can do about it?
So the way this is phrased is fun, but the Bible, in the same way that Genesis 1 doesn't communicate a scientific picture, Christian eschatology, which is the doctrine of how everything ends, also doesn't spell out a scientific picture. So no, you're not going to read the New or Old Testament and get a doctrine of global warming or a doctrine of climate change one way or the other. It's not a question they were asking. It's not going to come up. You do, from Genesis, get a doctrine of what's sometimes called creation care. The idea that there is a mandate given to humanity to steward, sometimes in the text it's subdue and have dominion, to steward the world God has given. That we're here as a sort of regent. That God says, I have made this world and I've given you charge of it. Given charge doesn't mean now do whatever you want, it'll be fine. Put in charge, right? I have two boys. One's 12, one's 6. Both of them are at home right now, and their parents are here, okay? I know, scientific experiment in the process right now. The 12-year-old was given charge of the 6-year-old, okay? What does that mean? Okay, if I go home and he's been beaten to a bloody pulp, that wasn't what we had in mind, and he will be informed of that loudly, right? Given charge, custodianship, is both a privilege and a huge responsibility. So God has given us this world, and we're supposed to take care of it. Scientists today are telling us, yes, there are some things humans can do that affect the world negatively. I am not thoroughly convinced of all the conclusions of climate science, mostly because of the physics and the math, that there are so many variables involved in climate science. I'm not sure we can know it with the certainty that we sometimes act like we do. Climate science is one of the most variable. The math is so intense. To be able to do predictive models is a near nightmare. So I'm not like just sold on it. At the same time, I don't think we should try to tear up the world and see if we're wrong about that. You know what I mean? So here's my biblical comparison. Satan takes Jesus to the top, the pinnacle of the tower, and says, you know, the Bible says, if you throw yourself off, the angels will catch you, lest you dash your foot against a stone. And Jesus says, you're right, and he jumps. That's not what happens. Jesus says, yeah, we don't test God. The fact that God said he would catch us doesn't mean we fling ourselves off of the top of things and see what happens, okay? God is got the universe in his hand, and I'm quite confident of that. that is not a good reason to go tear things up and see what happens because, well, he'll catch us, right? So I do think we have to figure out some kind of balance. And that's where the wisdom and the policy comes in, where we argue and fight. That does this amount of carbon, earth-hurting substance, right, carbon gas, it's going to do this much pollution. Is it worth it if it makes food available cheaper for poor families at this number? That's a hard question. Like if every environmental policy you wanted saved the earth but starved poor people, would that be a good idea? Or if I could make food free but it would destroy the earth in like 5 years, would that be a good idea? Like everything is a trade-off. Everything we do on the earth has a price. And so we have to figure out which ones are effective, which ones make sense. All the new science of energy also is going to have a price. Someday when you're bored, let me give you my rant about how wind energy changes climate. Like it was supposed to be the perfect energy source. The wind blows, we'll use that. And the Dutch, with all their windmills, found out that if you build enough windmills, it actually takes a certain amount of energy out of the air, and it actually changes your weather. In physics, it's the rule of thermodynamics is there's no free lunch. Like nothing in the universe is free. Everything has a price. The whole universe is winding down. It's just a question of how fast we get there. So we're going to have to be smart. We should be looking for new technologies and new ways to make the earth last as long as we can make it. We shouldn't say, God, we're going to trash it and we figure you'll clean it up. At the same time, we don't have to take a view that says at all cost, return the earth to a natural utopia, even at the cost of human life and livelihood. And that's the balance that I think Christians, better than anybody else, are equipped to have that conversation. We just probably don't want to.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And,
well, thank you.
You know, I think that, honestly, the science, I don't know enough to know about the science, like you said. It's extremely complicated. I mean, it is extremely complicated. And that's why there's so much confusion around it. So it really comes back to the same distinction we made before. What do you mean by climate change? Do you mean the method, the deliverables of what's being proven? Or do you mean the interpretation? And I don't say this to be dismissive, but I tend to think that the interpretation around the climate change, not the science of it, but the interpretation around it, is essentially the eschatology of a materialist worldview. I mean, it is what we see in the book of Revelation is our eschatology as Christians and other places in the Bible. And I think the cyclical outrage of climate and climate deniers and the feuding that goes on with that, that's the eschatology of a materialist worldview.
That's good.
I want to take some questions from the audience.
Okay, absolutely. All right, let's hear it.
Some questions from
Let's do it.
We're almost out of time, and we have
15 minutes?
one left.
Well, he doesn't maybe.
lightning round.
We got it. Yeah, we got 15 minutes. Let's do some questions from the audience. Let's appease Cole.
No one has any questions. I don't see any. Just kidding. Yep, go ahead.
Like you go to a museum or something and it says this has been radioactive for 6 billion years. Are they coded, dated? You know what I'm saying?
Yep, radiocarbon dating. Yep, yep.
I mean, where do they come up with that? How is it proved?
So, radiocarbon dating, or any dating method, is based on the idea that processes work the same over time. So let's imagine I have a room and I light a candle, okay? And I watch the candle and it burns down an inch in an hour, okay? Now the math is pretty simple at that point. If you burn down an inch an hour and it's a 6-inch candle, right? If I come back and it's, I can do some math and figure out how long has the candle been burning. What it doesn't account for is how long was the candle when we started? Did Cole come behind me and blow the candle out and then relight it later just to mess with my data? Did somebody open a door and there was a draft and the amount of oxygen in the room changed? There are variables it doesn't account for. So what radiocarbon dating does is says, okay, we know how radioactive decay works. If it worked exactly like it's working right now, how old is this thing? Okay? This old. And that works. They're not lying to you. Okay? It's not like every scientist who does dating is a crook or anti-Bible or anything. They're not lying to you. But they're using a method. And the method is, if everything is the way it is right now, what would that tell us? So based on that, if everything decayed exactly the way it is right now, and no one, made a universe yesterday or something, out of the blue, then this is how old it would be. But it's not accounting for any other variable, like, did God do anything? Did circumstances change in the natural realm? It happens sometimes. And a lot of those methods have been, I don't want to say they're inaccurate, they've been proven to be less consistent than hoped. There have been some funny experiments on things that could reliably be dated, like that we knew how old it was, and then we used the test, and it was like, yeah, it's 3 times that old. Like, okay, that didn't work out. Because there's just more variables. But what it's telling you is, all other things being equal, this is how old it has to be. But it doesn't, science can't know history. Science can only tell you what's going on right now. Karl Popper said that, by the way.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, science can only tell you what's going on right now. So based on what's going on right now, this thing would have to be that old. But it can't tell you what actually happened, just what would happen if what's going on right now had been going on for as long as it took to get here. Yeah.
In the same way that you kind of laid out Genesis 1 and 2, kind of both possibilities as far as the age of the earth and everything, I wondered if maybe both of you or one of you wanted to kind of lay out what are a couple of possible views, which alluded to Adam and Eve, a hybrid, like what are kind of some possibilities that, say, a biologos and Ken Ham might have
On Adam and Eve specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. Biologos actually allows for, you could sign on to the principles of biologos and believe that there was, that maybe there was never, modern genetics, there have been actually a couple of papers in the last 2 or 3 years that have disputed this, but for a while the consensus of modern genetics was there have never been less than somewhere between 13 and 20,000 hominids like us in the history of the universe. You'd have to have that many to create the genetic diversity that we have on the planet right now. So for somebody like Biologos who's basically saying, okay, so we want to know what you can prove for that set, of data. They would allow somebody to say, okay, maybe you had a group of hominids who God picked 2 of them and breathed life into them, and they became a separate and unique species known as human beings, created in the image of God, but with a ramp up to a certain level, and then God picks out 2 and he breathes life into them. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is what Tim Keller believes about the unique creation of Adam and Eve. I personally, based on how I read the text of the Bible, would say that's about as far as you can go in terms of saying we still have a unique, in the image of God, creation. But that to me is really pushing it. Now, in Biologos, you actually have people that say, no, there was a collective consciousness that somehow, some way, through the scope of evolution, these hominids became us, whatever. And this is always changing. Are they Homo sapiens or I think there's now another level in between, but through some act of evolutionary consciousness, they became human beings. You can be a Biologos and believe that. I think that's very difficult to square with what the Bible teaches about Adam and Eve. But there's a big debate about this, and in a lot of circles, and this isn't just a classic line of conservatives and liberals. There's evangelicals that are really debating, does the Bible mandate a real human Adam and Eve? And I think the kicker really is not just what does Genesis teach about this, but what is the witness of the rest of Scripture
Yes.
to the nature of Adam and Eve. So, for example, when Paul makes an argument about humanity being in Adam and humanity being in Christ, is Paul referring to a real Adam or a symbolic figurehead Adam? Like I said, I tend to read that passage and I think Paul is saying, through the inspired Holy Spirit, that there was a real Adam. There is a unique creation in the image of God of Adam. But this is a live debate in Biologos. Of course, if you're on the young earth creation side of things, this is not a problem because usually you have no pre-existing set of hominids of any kind. You have the creation of Adam and Eve from the literal dirt, and God breathes his life into them. That one actually has a very different set of parameters on how you could believe that that functions. And so it really is a debate, but I would lay that out as the spectrum on what most Christians believe and where I think you should draw the line on what the biblical text says.
I would, completely agree that the bigger problem is the New Testament interpreters more than it is Genesis. Like, there's probably some wiggle room in Genesis. It's a lot harder to find that in Paul or even in Jesus. You think about Matthew 19, where he's talking about marriage. He who made them at the beginning made them male and female. I mean, his picture of he who made them at the beginning made them however many hundreds of thousands of ancestors that ramped up to them and then eventually got married. I mean, it doesn't fit well with the ethical model of the way Jesus talks about marriage. You really got to just push on it a lot. And the same thing with Romans. You have to take it all over the place to make Romans work. They seem to both think of it in those terms of, well, there's Adam and Eve. Right. So I think you got some wiggle room in Genesis. I have a lot harder time with Paul and Jesus, actually, unless I get some kind of literal-ish Adam and Eve somewhere back there to make the rest of the story work. Yeah.
Is there anything in the Bible that can be proven using the scientific method?
Once there was this lady who came and told some guys, you're not going to believe it, but the tomb is empty, and I saw Jesus afterward. And to verify that fact, that hypothesis, these two guys ran to the tomb, and lo, it was empty, and they saw Jesus. And then Jesus said, touch my hand, and they did, and he was there. Now, back to our earlier point, you can't do science on history. So I can't go back in a time machine and visit the empty tomb. But it is interesting that the guys who investigated the empty tomb did everything you'd want them to do, right? I mean, they didn't say, oh, resurrections happen all the time. Of course they do. No, they said that's ridiculous. Resurrections never happen. Experience says the dead stay dead. They ran to the tomb and they saw two facts. One, it was empty, and two, they met the person who was supposed to be inside. There's nothing more scientifically you could ask of them. But to our question, can I go back and say, now show me the flood, or show me the resurrection, or show me the feeding of the 5,000, or Jesus walking on water? I can't reproduce that. In the same way, ask a different question. Is there anything in the life of George Washington you can prove scientifically? Same answer, no. The people that met him were pretty sure he was real, but I can't go into my lab and have them, go to Valley Forge in my laboratory. Like, it either happened or it didn't. So the past is something I can't access through science. But the people that experienced it were rational people and seemed pretty happy with the evidence. I think that, and maybe the point earlier about Lemaitre saying, hey, I think the universe had a beginning, you scientists are wrong, and now every scientist on the planet says the universe has a beginning, just like Genesis said. I'm not even making this up. In my office, I have one of my astrophysics textbooks on cosmology from third year at OU or something like that. And it's thoroughly secular, not a Christian author in any way, shape, or form. And you read all the way through it, and it goes through the whole bit. And then 7/8 of the way through, you're almost the back cover, there's a little section, and the author says, oddly enough, And he quotes Genesis 1 and 2 in the textbook and says, this is strangely similar with what we've come to believe, and then moves on. Like, that's incredible. I mean, as a student who was, again, a Christian kid at a college thinking they're going to ruin my faith, and to get in my textbook and say, what? You can't quote Genesis? Yeah. So those 2 points, like the people that experienced it felt like it was proven, and that the universe has a beginning, and that's what Moses told us all along, I think those are pretty good examples.
That's a great answer, and I think we should insist on the fact that the resurrection is not a spiritual event, it's a historical event. And certainly you do see a kind of scientific method in the Bible, but see, these are the really great questions of epistemology, is how do you know what you know? We'd probably do about as well saying, is there anything that you believe that has been validated using the scientific method? There may be a few things, and some of you out there that are really wired this way have tested your beliefs, and you've had hypotheses and you've done this, but most of us actually believe things on eyewitness testimony more than we believe things on the scientific method. That's just the way epistemology works. And if that's the case, this is a different conversation for another time, but if that's the case, we have the greatest eyewitness testimony of the things that Scripture says that would pass muster on any historical event you could come up with.
I promised we'd stop at 8, but if I were giving you a homework question, it would be, how do you know you're in Ada right now? Like, scientifically, none of you checked that out. I mean, none of you thought, well, I'm going to get a global positioning satellite, and then I'm going to do some geological tests to see if it matches up with what the data says should be in Ada. This could be a great conspiracy that I lied to you all and just put a sign up at the city gate. Actually, you're in Istanbul. I've got some people here to pretend it's Ada. You just take it for granted, whoever put the sign out front that says Ada, that's probably where I am. How do you know your parents are your parents? Most of us didn't do a DNA test. Some people told you one time, I'm your dad, and you said, okay. Most of the things you know are not things that you tested scientifically, and you're perfectly rational to believe them, and that's okay.
Well, and that's not a knock on science. That's actually to differentiate between the vast claims of the interpretive science versus the more narrow claims of the method of science. And that's what I think. Epistemologically, we do know things scientifically, but we know a lot of things on eyewitness testimony, trustworthy people experience, what we've been told, what we've seen. And that's to say there's a lot more balance than when we use the quote-unquote science, right? And so I would say one of the last questions on here is, what have we learned about science in the last 2 years? And I think this question addresses this perfectly. Yeah. And that's that there's a difference between science as a euphemism, right? Science has become a euphemism. Trust the science. Everybody in here has some vision of that, and it depends on a lot of things: experience, training, background, politics, religion. A lot of things go into that. But we've all realized that there's a way of using the word science to be a Trojan horse for something else. But what I want us to remember is, but there's another way to use the word science. And there's nothing about using the word science that way that is in conflict with our faith. And in fact, I actually think that we should be champions of that kind of methodological science.
All right. Can we get a round of applause for our guest speakers tonight?
And for Jim Baird.
And for Dr. Baird, wherever he is. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm sure you guys can come up and say something to Cole and Ben. I don't know. I just put them on the spot. Maybe they don't want to do that. But if you have any more questions, run them down and find out. Thank you, guys.